This year's Australian Grand Prix saw a record attendance of more than 400,000 people over the 4 days. This is the highest number of people since the first Melbourne Grand Prix in 1996. Australia has had a long history with Formula 1 and still has a loyal fan base. But why is F1 so big in Australia? Which Australian driver won a world championship with a car that he built himself, and which Australian race did F1 legends compete in before the Australian Grand Prix? Stay tuned to find out. Australian motorsport. Most countries have their own local motorsport category. The US has IndyCar and NASCAR, and Australia has V8 supercars. It is a big part of the racing culture in Australia, and whether you are a Ford man or a Holden man is a big thing. Holden was a popular Australian car manufacturer dating back to the 1920s. When the business started failing after 2010, the Australian government was putting over $200 million a year into the brand. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The car was more successful on the racetrack than on the road, with Holden cars winning the most famous Australian race, the Bathurst 1000, 34 times. At the Australian Grand Prix this year, Red Bull driver Sergio Perez got the opportunity to drive a V8 supercar around the F1 track. Even hometown hero Daniel Ricciardo has tried his hand at supercars before for a promotional video, but the F1 driver was thoroughly impressed by the speed and power of the V8 engine. Aussies can be proud of their homegrown motorsport. In 2014, the V8 cars were represented in an exhibition race with a real-life F1 Formula car. In 2014, the V8 cars were represented in an exhibition race with a real-life Formula 1 car. To show off the lightning speed of F1 cars, the V8 car was given a massive 45-second head start over the F1 car. That's more than half a lap at Albert Park. But it still wasn't enough. F1 driver David Coulthard was able to overtake the V8 car on the start-finish straight to steal the victory. Okay, V8 supercars may not quite match up to Formula 1 cars, but then again, nothing does. Which Australian driver built and raced his own car to win a world championship? And which small-town Australian race attracted some of F1's biggest names? Don't go anywhere, because all of that and more is coming right up. Categories. Everyone has to start somewhere. You don't just jump in a Formula 1 car and then start racing. In Europe, Formula 2 and GP2 series are used to help young drivers make their way up to F1. And Australia has its own junior categories for the same purpose. Australian Formula 2 or AF2 was started back in 1964 to bring together different competitions around the country. It had its heyday in the 1980s but has gone downhill since. It is only contested in one state of Australia and is no longer considered the top level of junior race, but it produced some quality racing drivers in Australia who became champions in tour car racing and the Australian Series V8 supercars. There was also an Australian Formula 1 in the 1970s, but just like AF2, it never really caught on. It costs a lot of money to run these junior categories, and even the European Series often struggles to find funding. The revenue structure is largely based on drivers bringing their own sponsorship money or self-funding. In Australia, with such a smaller audience and few drivers, it was never going to take off. Australia does have a strong karting championship for young drivers to cut their teeth in, but once they reach a certain level, they are advised to move to Europe if they want to make it big. The most successful drivers from Australia have all followed this path. Jack Brabham, Mark Webber, and Daniel Ricciardo all moved to Europe when they were young to pursue racing. So Australia has a lot of hopeful F1 drivers, but nowhere to race. Why is it so appealing in Australia? Drivers. We've already mentioned some of them, but let's have a look at Australia's most successful drivers. How did they make it from an isolated continent 9,000 miles from Monaco to Formula 1 stardom? The first name to know is Jack Brabham. You can't get much more self-made than this man. He was a flight mechanic and engineer who turned his craft to motor racing in the 1950s. He made his way up to motor racing and designed cars for both the Indianapolis 500 and Formula 1. But he wasn't content with just being in the garage. He wanted to be out there on the track. After establishing his own racing team, Brabham, he became the #1 driver and eventually won a world championship. This was his third world championship, but by far the most impressive. He is still the only driver to ever win the title with a car that he designed himself. For his achievements, he was awarded Australian of the Year, inducted into the Australian Hall of Fame, and even knighted by the Queen. Later, his cars were driven by Niki Lauda and won more championships with Nelson Piquet. The only other Australian to win a world championship is Alan Jones. When Jones first moved to Europe to pursue motorsport, he quickly realized that he couldn't afford to compete. So instead of driving the cars, he sold them. He opened up a second-hand car shop and saved up money for Formula 3. Through many ups and downs, Jones eventually made it to Formula 1 and won the championship in 1980. Unfortunately for Aussies, that was the last time an Australian driver won a world championship. Come on Danny Rick, it's about time. F1 in Australia. Because of the seasonal difference, many of the big European Formula One teams would spend their winters down in Australia during the 1960s. Back before the Melbourne and Adelaide circuits, the best track in the country was in Tasmania. The race attracted the best drivers in the world, many of which are part of racing history. Jack Brabham was closely involved with the popularity of the series. He drove alongside Jim Clark, who was a British two-time world champion. Another driver was Jackie Stewart, who won 3 world championships and started the Stewart Grand Prix team, which eventually became Red Bull. And you might recognize the name of Bruce McLaren too, who founded the McLaren Formula One team that still races today. The race in Tasmania only lasted until 1969, but it established Australia as a centre for motorsport around the world. But it wasn't until 1985 that Australia hosted an official Formula One race. It was booked as the last race of the season on a makeshift street circuit in the city centre of Adelaide. Because it was the last race of the season, it was the setting of some very controversial finishes. If you think Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton's ending to last year's season was controversial, wait until you hear about the 1994 Australian Grand Prix. Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill were fighting for the championship title. Michael was ahead by 1 point in the championship and Hill was gaining on him. But as the Hill tried to take over the Benetton driver, Schumacher turned suddenly into Hill, causing them both to retire from the race. It was Schumacher's first world championship, but some think it's little tainted. Crowd interest. Australians love sport. Football, rugby, cricket, swimming, anything that involves competitions, Australians are interested. So it should come as no surprise that Formula One has been a big hit there too. At the second Australian Grand Prix in Adelaide, more than 500,000 people showed up. It was one of the most successful races on the calendar, and it was enough for Adelaide's southern sister Melbourne to take an interest. Melbourne had more money and more power. So when they decided that holding a Grand Prix would be good for the city, their wish became a command. From 1996, Melbourne has been the home of Formula One in Australia. But over the years, the attendance has slowly dropped. That day in Adelaide in 1995 was the highest on record. And at its lowest point in 2016, only 272,000 people rocked up. That's because Formula One is expensive. It goes on for 3 whole days and most of the public don't really understand how it all works. Are the cars all the same? Why is everyone making such a big deal about tires? But more importantly, why was the government spending tens of millions of dollars on the event? In 2011, several local residents called for the race to be cancelled. Their local representative said that the declining crowds and rising costs meant that the race just wasn't worth it anymore. Race organizers have been praying for a boost in public interest ever since. And with Liberty Media taking over F1, their prayers were answered. The involvement of Netflix and its series Drive to Survive has sparked an unprecedented amount of interest in Australia and led to record crowds this year. At least it put Australia on the map. So, what do you think about the Australian Grand Prix? Did you know about the rich history of the country? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.